For most of modern history, people have been told that the international system was something permanent, something immovable, something as solid as a mountain. We grew up hearing about treaties, institutions, organizations, and alliances that appeared to stand like pillars, holding up the weight of global security and economic growth. Leaders stood in front of flags and signed agreements on glossy tables, promising stability and prosperity. Families planned their lives with the assumption that tomorrow would look roughly the same as today, and businesses invested with the belief that the system was predictable. Yet this assumption was always a carefully constructed illusion, a performance designed to give comfort, rather than a true reflection of reality. Stability was never a natural state. It was always negotiated, always fragile, always dependent on cooperation that could dissolve with a single shock. The architecture of the global order was built on something invisible. Trust, not just trust in leaders, but trust in the idea that rules mattered, that contracts would be honored, that markets would remain open, that borders would be respected. Trust functioned like the cement between bricks. Without it, the strongest steel beams of military power or financial institutions become useless. When you look back at history, the most catastrophic collapses have always begun with the erosion of trust, often quietly, long before the walls actually fell. The illusion of stability works like a drug. It calms the population, convinces businesses to expand, encourages investors to keep pouring money. But beneath that calm surface, pressure builds until cracks begin to show. The past 3 decades are a perfect example. After the Cold War, the world was promised a new era of globalization, where goods, services, and capital would move freely, lifting all nations into shared prosperity. Leaders that global institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, or the International Monetary Fund would ensure fairness. This narrative created a sense of permanence. People believed that we had reached the end of history, that competition between great powers was gone, that globalization was unstoppable. But what was really happening was a delicate balancing act. Nations were tolerating one another because it was profitable, not because their differences had been solved. This is why the illusion of stability was so dangerous. It convinced people to ignore the growing structural weaknesses at the core of the system. Take the example of debt. For decades, developed nations borrowed without restraint, assuming that their currencies and credit ratings would always shield them from real consequences. At the same time, emerging nations lent their labor, resources, and savings to sustain that borrowing. This arrangement looked stable, but it was inherently unsustainable. A system built on borrowing without accountability is like a skyscraper built on sand. The higher it rises, the more dramatic the collapse becomes. Yet people didn't see it this way because the illusion kept telling them the system is too strong to fail. History shows us that such illusions always break at the moment of maximum confidence. Another dimension of this illusion is the belief that military dominance guarantees stability. For decades, powerful nations assumed that because they possessed overwhelming military capabilities, the global order would remain under their control. But power is never absolute. Even the mightiest armies cannot prevent trust from evaporating, nor can they stop technology, trade, or alternative alliances from reshaping the balance. What military strength can do is create the appearance of stability. It can suppress conflicts, intimidate rivals, and reassure allies. But underneath, dissatisfaction grows. Eventually, when enough players feel excluded or betrayed, the facade cracks, and no amount of force can hold the structure together. The illusion also extended into daily life. Ordinary citizens believed that global supply chains were permanent. Supermarkets would always be stocked. Energy would always be cheap. Inflation would always remain low. Jobs would always be available. But as soon as a global shock arrived, whether it was a pandemic, a financial crisis, or geopolitical tension, the fragility was exposed. Ships stopped sailing, factories closed, energy prices spiked, and suddenly the smooth machine of globalization stuttered. People who once believed they lived in an era of abundance discovered that stability was never guaranteed. It was conditional on countless moving parts continuing to function in harmony. It is important to understand that illusions of stability are not accidents. They are designed, cultivated, and maintained deliberately by those in power. Governments reassure their people to prevent panic. Corporations emphasize predictability to attract investment. Media outlets repeat comforting narratives because fear does not sell optimism, and optimism is easier to control. This cycle creates a population that accepts stability as normal, when in reality, stability is the most unusual state of all. The natural condition of human society has always been turbulence, competition, and change. What we call stability is simply a pause between storms, a temporary arrangement before the next inevitable disruption. The danger of believing in illusions is that it blinds people to signals of collapse. When cracks appear, they are dismissed as temporary problems. Inflation is just a cycle. Geopolitical rivalry, it will calm down. Supply chain disruption, it will fix itself. But dismissing cracks is what allows them to widen until the structure falls. If a society is convinced that collapse is impossible, then it becomes completely unprepared when collapse begins. And this is precisely the situation today. People think the global order will bend but not break, that institutions may struggle but will not fall, that nations may argue but will not separate. The truth is the opposite. The foundation has already weakened, and the collapse has already begun. This illusion of stability explains why so many are shocked by the speed of change today. They cannot comprehend how alliances are fracturing, how currencies are weakening, how trust in international institutions is evaporating. They thought these pillars were eternal, but eternal pillars do not exist in human history. Every empire, every alliance, every financial system has eventually collapsed, not because of external enemies alone, but because the illusion of permanence convinced people to ignore the rot spreading from within. What is unfolding now is not a sudden crisis. It is the revealing of a truth that was hidden for decades. The global order was always a fragile agreement held together by convenience. The reason collapse feels so fast is not because it truly happened overnight. It is because people refused to see the slow decay while it was happening. They preferred the comfort of illusion to the discomfort of reality. And when illusions finally break, they shatter instantly, leaving no time to prepare. When people think about the global order, they often imagine a fixed hierarchy, a pyramid with the most powerful nations at the top and everyone else organized neatly below. This is the image that has been projected for decades, reinforced by history books, economic reports, and political speeches. But in reality, power has never been fixed. It is fluid, constantly shifting like the tide. What was considered unshakable yesterday can suddenly look vulnerable today. The global order is collapsing faster than expected, not only because it is weakening, but because the very center of power is moving. And it is moving at a pace that traditional powers did not anticipate. For most of the 20th century, the center of gravity rested firmly in the hands of a small group of countries. They dictated the rules of trade, controlled the most important financial institutions, and held unmatched influence in global organizations. Their dominance was reinforced by their economic size, their military power, and their technological edge. For a while, it seemed inevitable that this arrangement would last for generations. But the world does not operate according to the expectations of the powerful. It evolves according to the energy, ambition, and adaptability of those willing to change faster than others. That is why today we are witnessing an unmistakable transfer of influence, and this transfer is not happening gradually, it is happening at lightning speed. The first sign of this shift is in the economy. Nations that were once dismissed as developing have now become engines of growth. Their markets are expanding, their consumers are rising in purchasing power, and their companies are competing on a global scale. While traditional powers struggle with slowing growth, rising debt, and aging populations, these emerging economies are building new infrastructure, investing in innovation, and expanding trade networks across continents. The effect is not just the rise of new players, it is the relative decline of those who once believed their dominance was secure. When a nation that was once the world's factory becomes a leader in advanced technology, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy, it signals not just economic progress, but a rewriting of the hierarchy. Trade patterns themselves tell the story. For decades, most of the world's commerce flowed through to establish Western routes under Western financial systems and using Western currencies. Today, new corridors are being built that bypass the old hubs entirely. Railways and ports connect regions that used to trade only indirectly. New financial systems are being created that reduce dependency on old institutions. Digital currencies and bilateral agreements are challenging the supremacy of established reserve currencies. Each of these developments represents more than just economics. It represents a redistribution of influence. When nations realize they no longer need to depend on one dominant system to grow, the illusion of a single global order disappears. Another element accelerating this shift is demographics. Traditional powers face shrinking populations, while younger, more dynamic nations are expanding their workforces and consuming more goods. A younger population means more innovation, more risk-taking, and more willingness to adapt to new realities. Demographics are destiny in global competition, and those with energy, creativity, and ambition will inevitably push the world's center of gravity toward themselves. This is not something that can be reversed by policy or military might. No matter how much wealth or weaponry a nation has, it cannot stop time, and time is favoring those whose populations are still young and growing. Technology has become the battlefield where this power shift is most visible. Control of advanced technologies, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, renewable energy, digital finance has become more important than control of land or even natural resources. In this arena, emerging powers are not only catching up, they are leapfrogging, they are building new platforms that do not depend on the old systems. They are innovating faster, scaling quicker, and applying technology to solve problems that older powers have neglected. Once again, the shift is not only about capability, it is about perception. The world is beginning to look toward new centers for leadership in innovation, no longer automatically assuming that the old capitals hold all the answers. Geopolitics amplifies these changes. When new alliances form between nations that once stood on the margins, it alters the balance of power in ways that ripple across the globe. Organizations outside the traditional order are gaining strength, creating their own economic frameworks, financial mechanisms, and strategic partnerships. These alliances may not yet be as polished or institutionalized as the old ones, but they are growing, and their growth represents a direct challenge to the established system. When multiple nations combine their resources, their markets, and their political will, they create leverage that even the most powerful countries cannot ignore. This collective momentum pushes the center of power further away from its traditional core. The collapse of the global order, then, is not only about institutions failing or agreements breaking down. It is about the realization that power is not where it used to be. This realization creates uncertainty, and uncertainty accelerates collapse. Investors begin to move their capital to new markets. Companies shift their supply chains toward new partners. Governments start adjusting their foreign policies to align with the emerging centers. Each small adjustment represents a loss of confidence in the old order and a transfer of confidence to the new. It is a process that feeds on itself, accelerating as more players decide that the future lies elsewhere. What makes this moment especially urgent is the speed. In the past, power transitions took centuries. Empires rose and fell slowly with long periods of adjustment. Today, technological acceleration, financial interconnectivity, and instantaneous communication make shifts occur within decades, even within years. A new technology can emerge, scale globally, and disrupt entire industries faster than a government can write legislation to regulate it. An emerging economy can rise to the top ranks in trade within a single generation. Old powers that assumed they had time to adapt suddenly find themselves caught off guard, unprepared for the pace of change. This mismatch between expectation and reality is what makes the collapse feel so sudden. It is not that the old powers have disappeared. They still possess resources, institutions, and influence, but their dominance is no longer absolute. They now compete in a multipolar world where influence is distributed, where new players are setting the agenda, and where the center of gravity is constantly shifting. The illusion that one group of nations can permanently control the system has been broken, and the world is adjusting to this new reality at an accelerated pace. The collapse of the old order is simply the byproduct of the rise of a new one, and the speed of that rise is what shocks those who assumed power would always remain where it had been. For centuries, power was measured by territory, armies, and natural resources. Nations expanded their borders, accumulated gold, controlled trade routes, and built vast militaries to secure influence. But in today's world, technology has become the most decisive disruptor, a force that rewrites the rules faster than governments can adapt. What makes technology different from traditional power is its speed, its reach, and its ability to transform systems without asking permission from political leaders. The global order is collapsing not just because of geopolitical rivalry or economic strain, but because technology has outpaced the very structures that were meant to regulate and sustain it. When we think of the old order, we think of treaties, organizations, and institutions designed to set boundaries and rules. These structures were created in an age when changes unfolded over decades. Policies could be debated, laws could be crafted, and nations could slowly adjust to new realities. Technology has broken this rhythm. Innovations that used to take generations now emerge within years, sometimes even months, and their effects ripple across the globe instantly. A breakthrough in artificial intelligence in one lab can transform industries in multiple countries within weeks. A new payment system built on digital currencies can bypass traditional banks and financial institutions overnight. The sheer velocity of technological disruption leaves traditional powers scrambling to respond, always one step behind. Artificial intelligence illustrates this perfectly. For decades, the global order was built on the assumption that certain countries had a permanent lead in innovation. But AI has leveled that advantage. Nations with skilled engineers, strong data infrastructure, and bold strategies can leap ahead quickly, regardless of whether they were once considered leaders. What makes AI even more disruptive is its dual nature. It is both a tool for economic growth and a weapon of strategic power. It changes how businesses operate, how militaries plan, how governments monitor citizens, and how societies understand themselves. And because it cannot be contained within borders, AI shifts the balance of power in ways that no single institution can fully control. Digital currencies and blockchain technology are another example of disruption that destabilizes the global order. For decades, the dominance of a few reserve currencies gave certain nations outsized influence over global finance. Sanctions, monetary policy, and control of financial flows were tools used to maintain order. But digital currencies undermine that dominance by creating new ways to transfer value outside traditional systems. Nations, companies, and even individuals can now exchange wealth without going through old channels. This weakens the power of established financial institutions and creates a parallel system of trust built on code rather than politics. Once again, the speed of adoption makes regulation nearly impossible to enforce. By the time laws are debated, millions of transactions have already reshaped financial flows, diminishing the authority of the old order. Energy technology adds another layer to this disruption. The old order was defined by oil, gas, and coal. Coal, control of resources, meant control of influence. Wars were fought and alliances formed around these commodities. But renewable energy technologies, solar, wind, batteries, and nuclear advancements are decentralizing power production. A nation no longer needs vast oil reserves to power its economy if it can generate its own renewable energy at scale. This undermines the leverage of countries that once dominated because of their natural resources. It also destabilizes global energy markets as investments shift away from traditional players toward innovators. The collapse of the old order is accelerated as the very foundation of energy power is rewritten. Technology also disrupts supply chains, which were once considered the backbone of globalization. For decades, the global order relied on a system where goods were produced in one region, shipped across oceans, and consumed in another. This system was managed by agreements, trade institutions, and multinational corporations. But automation, robotics, and 3D printing are changing that logic. Nations and companies can now manufacture locally with far fewer resources. This reduces dependency on global trade routes and undermines the institutions that manage them. The old system of interdependence that tied countries together is being replaced by decentralized production, which erodes the very logic of globalization that defined the past 3 decades. Perhaps the most profound impact of technology lies in information. In the old order, control of media and communication was centralized. Governments and large corporations shaped narratives and maintained authority. Today, digital platforms and social networks allow information to spread instantly, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. Narratives that once took years to shape now emerge in hours. Movements that would have been suppressed in the past now gather millions of supporters online. Disinformation spreads as fast as truth, making it impossible to maintain a unified narrative. This undermines trust not just in governments, but in the very institutions that were supposed to uphold order. When citizens no longer believe in shared facts, the legitimacy of the system collapses from within. Technology does not just disrupt existing structures, It creates entirely new ecosystems that compete with the old ones. Consider the rise of digital platforms that operate across borders, bigger and more powerful than many governments. These platforms manage commerce, communication, and even identity verification for billions of people. They are not bound by traditional rules of sovereignty, yet they shape the daily lives of citizens everywhere. Governments may try to regulate them, but the global scale of these companies means they can simply relocate, adapt, or innovate faster than regulation can catch them. The global order, which once assumed the nation states as the ultimate authority, is being challenged by corporations and platforms that wield influence beyond the reach of borders. This disruption extends into security as well. Cyber warfare has become a weapon of choice for states and non-state actors alike. Unlike traditional military power, which requires tanks, ships, and soldiers, cyber weapons require only knowledge, access, and intent. A small group of hackers can paralyze critical infrastructure, steal secrets, or manipulate financial systems without firing a single shot. The old logic of deterrence, based on visible weapons and armies, no longer applies. Nations can be attacked without warning, and attribution is often uncertain. This makes the global order unstable because the rules of engagement are unclear and traditional institutions are ill-equipped to manage such threats. The key to understanding why technology is the most disruptive force is that it redefines power itself. Power is no longer measured solely by territory, resources, or armies. It is measured by data, algorithms, networks, and the ability to innovate. Those who adapt to this reality rise quickly. Those who cling to the old definitions of power decline just as fast. The collapse of the global order is not just about failing alliances or weakening economies. It is about the fact that the rules by which the order was built no longer apply in a world dominated by technology. Institutions, laws, and agreements crafted in the 20th century cannot keep up with the forces reshaping the 21st. The result is not merely disruption but dislocation, as entire systems struggle to adjust to a reality that evolves faster than they can comprehend. One of the greatest errors societies make is assuming that change happens slowly, that disruption will give advance warning, and that collapse will be gradual enough to prepare for. This assumption is comforting, but it is also fatal. People believe they have decades before the global system breaks apart, that the cracks in institutions will hold for another generation, that the turbulence in markets will eventually stabilize. The reality is far harsher. The pace of collapse is accelerating, and those who wait for certainty will discover too late that the future has already arrived. The urgent wake-up call today is not about predicting collapse, but about recognizing that it is unfolding now, faster than most are willing to accept. History shows that collapse rarely announces itself in a dramatic, unmistakable way. It begins with whispers, small signals that are easy to dismiss. A debt crisis here, a currency losing strength there, an unexpected shortage in supply chains, a sudden shift in alliances. Each of these alone may seem manageable, but together they create momentum. The system begins to wobble, and those who trusted in its permanence find themselves unprepared. The problem is not that the warning signs are invisible. It is that people refuse to see them because they are clinging to the illusion that stability is the norm. They want to believe they still have time, but time is the one luxury the world no longer provides. Consider the speed of recent global shocks. A pandemic spread across continents in weeks, freezing supply chains and paralyzing economies. Financial markets that were assumed to be resilient collapsed within days of panic. Energy prices that were thought to be stable spiked overnight. Wars erupted in regions that were declared stable only months before. Each of these shocks revealed a simple truth. The global order does not unwind gently. It unravels in rapid bursts that compound one another, leaving no space for slow adaptation. This is why the call to wake up is urgent. People who are still acting as if the future will look like the past are standing on quicksand. The speed of collapse is also fueled by technology. In earlier centuries, empires rose and fell over decades, sometimes centuries, giving societies time to adjust. Today, information spreads instantly. Capital moves at the click of a button, and supply chains can be disrupted by a single algorithm or cyber attack. A rumor can destabilize markets in minutes. A technological breakthrough can render entire industries obsolete in less than a year. A geopolitical crisis can ripple through trade networks instantly, halting goods, raising prices, and eroding trust. The compression of time means that collapse does not unfold over generations. It unfolds in real time, visible to everyone, yet ignored by many until it is too late. Another reason the wake-up call is urgent lies in perception. Most people do not prepare for change until they are forced to, and by then the options are limited. Leaders assure their citizens that crises are temporary. Investors reassure themselves that markets always rebound, and ordinary families tell themselves that disruption is only for other regions, not theirs. This false comfort delays action, which only deepens vulnerability. By the time reality can no longer be denied, the window to adapt has already closed. This is the danger of ignoring urgency. It creates paralysis disguised as patience. The refusal to act early is what transforms manageable disruptions into uncontrollable collapse. Look at debt as a case study. Nations have accumulated obligations at levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, assuming that they can always borrow more or print their way out of trouble. Investors continue to lend because they trust the illusion that governments cannot fail. But when confidence erodes, collapse is immediate. Bond markets dry up, currencies weaken, and inflation spirals within weeks. This is not a slow process. It is a chain reaction that accelerates with every passing day. The global order is built on these financial assumptions, and when they crack, the entire structure begins to tilt. The urgency comes from the fact that these cracks are visible now, not in some distant future. A wake-up call is also about geopolitics. Old alliances that once guaranteed security are straining under the weight of diverging interests. New blocs are forming with speed, rewriting the rules of trade and cooperation. The assumption that the world would always be governed by the same institutions is already outdated. Meetings and summits may still happen, but their influence is diminishing with each passing year. The reality is that power is being redistributed quickly, and those who fail to adjust their strategies will find themselves isolated. Nations that still operate as though they have unlimited time to protect their dominance are already losing influence because they underestimate how quickly alternatives are emerging. For ordinary people, the urgency is even more personal. Jobs that seemed stable for a lifetime are vanishing within a few years. Skills that were valuable yesterday are being replaced by machines and algorithms. Savings lose value when currencies weaken and the cost of living rises faster than wages. These changes are not projections, they are daily realities for millions. Yet many still cling to the hope that the disruptions will slow down, that governments will restore balance, that institutions will regain control. The truth is that no one can restore the old order. The world has moved into a new phase where adaptation is the only survival strategy, and hesitation is the greatest risk. The essence of this wake-up call is that the collapse of the global order is not a distant possibility, but a present reality, happening faster than expected. because the systems built to slow it down no longer function. Institutions are gridlocked. Leaders are reactive rather than proactive, and the population is distracted by the comfort of yesterday's assumptions. Each day that passes without recognition of this reality narrows the path forward. The urgency is not simply to acknowledge that change is coming, but to realize that it has already arrived. And those who fail to act now will find themselves watching the collapse from the ruins of a world they believed was still intact.